Hello, everyone, and welcome to Methi Muslim. I'm Mariyam Haider, producer and host of the podcast, and I'm joined by journalist, playwright, and award winning author Annie Zaidi. Annie has written several books, including City of Incident, Prelude to a Riot, and Bread Cement Cactus, a memoir of belonging and dislocation, and is the editor of Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing. In this episode, Annie and I discuss her memoir, which is her journey to answering questions around her identity and belonging to the country she's born in, the name she carries, and the life she has lived. She investigates the vestiges of memories that have shaped her life in India, the homes she's lived in, her relationships with certain family members, friends, and those she interacted with and observed over the course of living with this question. She makes acute observations about how the state influences who belongs where, depending on their status and location in the society. Chapter by chapter, Annie invokes the idea of belonging, displacement, migration, and movement, not just for herself, but millions of Indians, especially those on the margins or living as minorities. Bread Cement Cactus is a formidable read and asks deeper questions with eloquence, leading to some answers for the readers themselves. Hi, Annie. Thank you so much for joining Memoir Muslim podcast. And firstly, I really want to deeply thank you for writing, Bread Cement Cactus, because I think the book is a gift of sorts, in terms of recollection, reminiscence, and also just the amount of fortitude it takes to understand the idea and the meaning behind belonging throughout the journey that one makes. And I think as I was reading the book, the most important aspect for me has been that now I'll go back to your book thinking it's like a lighthouse that's sort of like spotlighting aspects of my own life and my own upbringing, and making me investigate further, how do I really find connection to those pieces of my life? So yeah, thank you so much for the book, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Thank you for asking me and for your kind words. It's quite an honor to be invited. I've been listening to this podcast for a while now, and it's good to hear different views on identity.
Thank you. It means a lot to me actually that for your what you're saying and sharing. So I think what I really want to begin with, and we briefly discussed it in our last conversation, is really how did the idea about writing this memoir come about? And, like the amount of time you spend in the research, the sort of like recollection of sorts. When you look back, what is it that you might think you missed out on and you probably would need to write more about?
Well, I'll be very honest. The idea of it came actually from not from me, but from the prize. The book comes out of an essay that won a prize, and as part of the prize, they expect you to deliver a book by the end of the year. I was a freelance writer and was desperate for money, have been desperate for over a decade, and I would just keep pitching, keep writing, keep applying to contests, just see what anything, any way of making a living as a writer. And one year was particularly bad, the year before the prize, actually, because media spaces were shrinking, income was shrinking, not keeping up with inflation, that kind of thing. And I was at the same time, of course, very troubled because identity had become such a sore spot in our country. Suddenly, perhaps not suddenly, like as I say in the book, it's been 100-year long process. But to me, it felt suddenly urgent, also because of what we were experiencing and feeling, and just feeling troubled about questions of identity. Um, when I saw the call for the prize, it was an invitation for you to respond to a question. And the question was, can you still say that there's no place like home? The proverb is that there's no place like home. does that question still matter, that there's no place like home? And of course, I mean, the question also comes from a Western perspective, and because the prize is obviously based out of an organization that works in the West. So yes, but I did think that it was very interesting and with international connotations. The question of home is universal, the question of belonging is universal. How you are able to respond to that question can be very specific, though, depending on your region, your location, your religion, faith, color, caste, all of those things. So I thought that this is a question I can respond to, partly because in different ways, I have been trying to address this question of home and belonging and identity for looking back almost all of my life. When I wrote my first nonfiction book, it was mainly reportage, but even there, once I began to write the book, I began to remember, I'd forgotten actually, but then I began to remember that right from the beginning, I have been grappling with this question. And as a reporter, when you go on the field, things are okay, you're just thinking of yourself as a reporter or a representative of the organization that you're working with. You show up there and you see the way identity is playing itself out. You are in a position of slight privilege because you work for an English language paper and you see that language actually has a great deal of power and the way power and language function. But you also see that in your own way, you're also kind of marginal because you write in English. There are people who will keep writing in English and have no impact at all. And people who write in Hindi with very large circulated dailies and they have more impact because they're read more. But then people who write in Hindi often aren't paid much. So then that forces them into certain kinds of compromises. And because, journalists are expected to also bring income for the paper through advertisements and things like that. And then that was very troubling to me to understand. I didn't fully understand, but I was just beginning to understand that power is embedded in language. At the same time, I also discovered my own powerlessness, not only in terms of not having impact, but also seeing that, okay, I'm a woman, I'm in a small town, not a single female journalist. I've traveled to so many smaller towns. And at least I'm talking about, that first decade of the millennium. That's when I did most of my traveling and writing. And I met one female journalist in Udaipur. And Udaipur isn't a small town as such. It's quite a large town. But in the kasbahs, in the district level places. At that time, Khabar Lahariya hadn't been set up, or maybe it had been set up, but, I hadn't gone to Banda and they were limited to Banda. Even now, Banda is one place, that you and one district in UP or a few districts in UP. Even now, even if you go to, say, places like Jaipur, you go to Chandigarh, you go to Lucknow, these are capital cities, very big, very powerful places, but you'll see that there are fewer women or handling softer beats, sort of not right at the heart of where the difficult reportage happens. I was looking at that too, but I was also getting questions about what are you? I've written about this in my first book. It's out of print, so most people now may not have read it. There's this conversation and it made me very mad, and these questions used to leave me very uncomfortable. I hate talking about identity. I think in my family, this question of what you are, it was not a polite question, firstly, to ask anyone, aap kya ho? This was just, what is your religion? What is your caste? These things were just, to me, it was unthinkable to even ask those things. But having come this far, having had conversations with other people, especially people who write about caste, I also understand now that that not having to answer that question or not having these conversations implied my own privilege because, nobody asks you because you're so comfortable in your particular caste location. So you don't need to answer that question. And I think even as a Muslim, the fact that we didn't have these conversations, there was some privilege within that, that even now me and my brother talk about this, about how that for us, it's just so bizarre. These conversations like, ki wo Hindu hai, wo ye hai. It just didn't happen, in our home, it didn't happen. But at the same time, I think we were also a little bit in denial because the moment we stepped outside the family, the conversations happened. And we either disregarded them or we were so kind of hurt by them that we just kind of went into a shell. And then we didn't want to talk about it anymore. So there was that. And when you report, obviously, you don't have that protection and you're out there and somebody's asking you something. And it is very annoying. For me, it was both annoying and a little bit frightening to see how urgent and important this question is for everyone else. And I was initially just reluctant and I was refusing to answer. I remember at a railway station, there was this woman who said, Ki, aap kya ho? And this because I was not reporting at that time. I was just waiting for a train. I think I took all my belligerence out onto this poor woman because I just dug in my heels and I said, I will not answer the question. So I told them nothing. He said, what do you mean you're nothing? I said, what do you mean by what you are? She said, kya ho aap? So I said, मैं reporter हूँ. And then she said, no, but what I mean is that, I said, what do you mean? She said, what is your religion? And I think she used the word jat, actually, caste. But I think that word jat also includes religion. When people ask for jat, they want to immediately know both. So I said, I actually didn't say anything at all at first. And then I told her that actually, I don't know myself what I am. She said, how is that possible? I said, my parents didn't tell me. She said, how is that possible? She said, just, we just don't have these conversations at home. And then she just stared at me for a few seconds. And then she said, that's not possible. And I said, you think what you like, but in my case, it's possible. And it was a little bit dishonest because, of course, I knew who I was. And it's not true that I didn't know what I was. But I refused to have that conversation. And I found myself lashing back at people who were asking me. But I think as things got worse, as this question kind of, there was no avoiding that question anymore once these public floggings and the lynching started to happen. I think after that, some shift has happened. I answer people very directly now. If you want to know, I'll tell you. Okay. But what are you going to do with this information? Is it going to affect how we talk? Is it going to affect my work? If it does, then I'm not going to lie. In order to protect something else, I'm not going to lie about the identity. So I have now shifted the onus of grappling with this question onto the person who wants to know and not made it my problem.
I mean,
but yeah, so these, sorry.
No, please finish your thought.
Yeah. So that was, I think that question had been there in the background to respond more directly to your question. It's been there in the background of my life since the beginning. And when I sat down to write an essay for the prize, that was what I was primarily at the back of my head. But at the same time, because of my reportage, I had also come a lot upon displacement. I wrote a tiny booklet, which is often not listed because it was commissioned by an NGO. So it's not listed often on, online and places like Amazon, etc. This was a kind of reporter's diary. When I went freelance first, I wrote a reporter's diary about displacement. I'd already written several stories. This one was the first time where I had been going into the field and reporting like most reporters for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, usually not more than a week. This was the first time I went and stayed in the village, like unlike where I would go report, meet people for a few hours, then go back to my hotel or wherever I could afford to stay. This time I actually stayed with a few people in different locations for about a week. the experience was completely different, and it shaped and changed my thinking, fine-tuned my thinking, you could say. And the diary was called, in Hindi, it was translated into Hindi. It was called Kiske Hisse Aayegi Roshni, and in English, it was published as Who Will See the Light, because this was mainly about displacement, that is, for electricity purposes, for making dams, for making nuclear plants that will supply electricity, etc. And I think this intersection of identity, the question of who gets displaced, mostly Adivasis, the question of what your identity is after you get displaced, the question of how solidarities are formed, and the question of my own grappling with identity. All of these were kind of feeding into my head for over a decade. And when I sat down to write that essay, these different things were all coming together. And one of the things you had to do along with the essay was write a list of chapters, that you submit the essay and you submit a plan for the book. And when I sat down to write the chapters, I suddenly had a lot of clarity about, okay, so broadly, these are the patterns along which I've been thinking, and these are the themes I would like to develop.
So, when I finished your book, I realized that there was a lot of not just like clarity, like it brought to you. In a way, the book kind of liberated me from the sense of grappling and the sense of misunderstanding that people have about me. The way that when people look at me, like what do they perceive? Like in the context of being a Muslim and being an Indian as well, like there are so many multitudes to it, but you can't just say it when someone's just like, "Aap kya ho?" Or are you? It's like, "Oh, are you a Muslim?" or "Are you a mom?" Like even those simple phrases are used to sometimes just make me feel very confused, and the confusion was primarily because it's not a simple answer. I just can't. I can tell you, yes, I'm Muslim, and then you might have like sort of like a worksheet of sorts where oh, she's a Muslim, so this is who she is, or this is her background of sorts, which might not be the case, and there's a very high chance that you're wrong. So when I read your book, in a sense, I felt liberated, because in a very, I would say, I mean, you've kind of said it already, but in a very simple manner, you have taken those threads that are complicated, that are not easy to fathom, and kind of made sure that each of it gets its own ending. So each chapter had its own ending. So by the time the book is finished, I know that there are more questions and more thoughts that are arising in my mind, but they're not coming from a sense of confusion. They're coming from a sense of inquiry. Like I'm genuinely curious, my belonging to my mother tongue, and it can be very different to what you write. I'm curious about my father's so my father's history with Badayu and my sort of second-tier history with Badayu. And when you talk about your grandfather's association, with Azamgarh, like there are so many threads that I could now feel that I want to also inquire, but not from a place of, I don't know, I'm not sure, or I don't know if I can understand it, but simply because I was curious now. Did you feel a sense of, I don't know, ease or liberation of sorts when you ended the book, after having kind of answered some of those questions for yourself?
I would say ease, but I was glad to have done it. And I think partly also because, when you're applying for something, you have vague thoughts, and you put down those thoughts as, like when you apply for a grant or proposal or whatever. I'm sure you know this. You put down your sense of what you might write, but that is completely different from what you actually end up writing, because when you begin, you haven't really had the time to delve into those ideas. For example, I did have clarity about displacement. I already knew that. I did have to go back to revisit the place where I grew up and look at it with adult eyes, etc. But I knew the ideas. I knew the theory that I wanted to kind of put forward, etc. I hadn't thought about language in such depth. I hadn't, before I started writing the book, I hadn't read, for example, Alok Rai's Hindi nationalism fully. I'd read bits and pieces here and there. So my reading around places, I read much more about Allahabad, for example. Until then, it was just like Nani Ka Ghar. I wasn't that interested in its socio-political location. When the name change happened, that's when I got more interested in all of that. Having developed it, I felt that I knew. You instinctively feel certain things. You don't know why you feel certain things. In writing, I understood myself, and that was good. I also completely, for example, that chapter on women was a chapter that I had not planned. It wasn't there in the original book plan. But when I started talking to people that, I've got this prize, I'm working on this book, very often the response from women was quite different. Like they'd begin to say, oh, how interesting. Oh, this is quite interesting. And they would talk about home for some time. And more than once, a woman would say, yeah, but where does a woman have any home? Basically, women have no homes. And when they said that, I was very taken aback. I was like, okay, this I wasn't expecting. So I sat down to think about it, and I said, how can I, as a woman, write a book about home and belonging and not write about women? Because they are the biggest displaced and permanently displaced category, especially in South Asia. You know how it is. You move into someone's house, it's not like both of you move into a separate neutral ground, sort of. So I began to think of those things. And then I also began to remember the tiny bits that, just before we started this conversation, you asked me about difficulties. One of the difficult things about writing this book was in the woman chapter, I decided to write about my mother and the way in which this very small thing she says. And, my mother is the most open-minded and liberal mother I have come across, never discriminated while we were growing up, at least, and there was never this question of you can't do this because you're a girl or whatever it is. It was only after I grew up and became a young woman that she began to get nervous, I think, because, maybe her own conditioning, maybe also just how do you make a young woman, this young daughter, how do you make her fit into the world, right? So, and then some of those things started to come out of her, which I don't think she intended in any serious way. And I don't think she even remembered after having said it that she has said this. But when we would fight, she would end up saying something like, हाँ मुझसे तो लड़ लो. When you go to that other house, then who will you fight with? All mothers say those things. And I would find them really hurtful. But when I sat down to write the book, I had this decision to make. Should I write about this? Because this involves her too. And I knew that if I write this, this will hurt her a little bit. And it did hurt a little bit, I think. Maybe not a lot, but a little. Because she was like, when did I ever say this? And no, Mom, you didn't. Yeah, these things were a little bit difficult for me because the more personal it gets, the harder it is. You're going to, if you're writing about difficult things and about people who love you and whom you love a lot, those are the difficult bits. Having written it, I feel glad because actually, immediately the moment I wrote it, she stopped saying it.
Nice.
Not even as a yeah. I think that sometimes the act of writing, the act of articulating, the act of expressing something, you put information about your feelings into the space between you and other people. And through writing the book, I think one thing that I do feel glad about is that I feel like I've said what I had to say. At least people who know me, people who have read my book. If having read it, you do not change your behavior in whatever small way. For example, if you've read my book and you see that it troubles me that you're constantly asking about religion or caste or whatever it is, and you still persist in doing that, Well, I don't know what to say, because then it's almost like saying that you're deliberately set upon a certain course of action, and you know that it is painful for other people, but you will continue to do this. So in that way, you can say it is liberating, because I fulfilled my responsibility of letting you know how I feel. Now it is up to you to respond to that.
Annie, I think one thing that, like, while you were talking about just how you look at when now you've kind of given your answer, you've put this book together, and if someone still asks you, it's on them. I think one realization I had in the last few years is also that I no longer want to make things comfortable for people, especially when they're asking these questions to me. It's not my burden, and neither is it my responsibility to express sort of like, just, I don't want to simplify the complexity of what it means to live like this, right? It's really not my job. And this is one of the questions that I was thinking about while, thinking about speaking with you is, have you seen people around you also understand this complexity better, where they are also changing their understanding about identities? And they don't necessarily need to be Indian Muslim, but they have different set of identities that they associate with. And with times, with more, with writing like yours, with just knowing that it's easier to grapple with the complexity than to hold yourself to a simplistic definition. Has that been something you've also seen around you?
Yeah, I think not in my immediate circle so much. Like I wouldn't be able to name a person I know very well who has changed in that sense. I think in my own family, yes, we've begun to have more conversations, but I think our identities were already very complex. We just talk about them more openly now. In I am from social media conversations, I do get a sense that there is a lot of contestation about complex identity. So, for example, the Pasmanda movement, I'm seeing more people at least acknowledge it, the question
Right.
of caste amongst Muslims in South Asia. From across the border in Pakistan and Bangladesh, I'm beginning to see more. Maybe it's not so much that the conversations didn't exist earlier, but because they're out there in public on social media, I'm seeing at least some interrogation of what privilege is, what complexity of identity means, etc. I do think that one problem with majoritarian discourse in general is that even when you're interrogating it from a majoritarian viewpoint. So the change is very slow to come, very slow. And I think that even people who inhabit a complex identity and want to continue inhabiting a certain complexity are usually people who are actually fairly comfortable and can inhabit whatever they like. What I would like to see is people understanding and talking about the complexity of identity at all levels. Not just marginalized people, but also people who, for example, are not very well off financially, but who are, say, in a position of relative privilege from, say, a caste location or a religion location or a race location even. I would begin to like to see those questions. I actually am a little concerned that what's happening is that the privileged, because of these social media conversations, because of certain pushback from the margins, all kinds of margins, gender, sex, whatever it is, what's starting to happen is that some people are interrogating more and more and more. Like I interrogate constantly, even though I'm not, say, very well off. But okay, I look at the conversations, say, around transphobia, or I look at the conversations around race, and I say that, okay, yes, they have a point. So let me change my own thinking. Let me begin to follow other people instead of just talking about my own ideas, just listen for a while. I am not sure, I could be wrong about this, but I'm not sure that those conversations are happening across the board. There is a lot more hardening in many sections. I also see that and I hear that. People just don't want to hear certain things, and they're just like that because they can afford to, and perhaps because hardening also gives them a certain amount of power and privilege. Complexity would force them to relinquish certain privileges, which no one wants to do.
Yeah, I have heard it in some of the most what would be liberal voices, whether they are in extended family or just largely on social media as well. I know that they can often speak something like that, but practice something which is still very much, inherent to their privilege, inherent to their essentially their caste, their class privileges that they come from. So it's and I wonder if I mean, for me personally, I mean, I just simply can't operate in a place like that because there's this dissonance that just doesn't allow me to work or write what I would like to write. And it's baffling sometimes, frankly speaking, to know someone, just externally and one like, oh, they're pretty, open-minded, very, very liberal, and they are very educated as well. And you meet them and you like, something breaks down. You're like, oh, they're still holding on to their privilege. They're still holding on to their class. They still firmly believe that this is how the world is. Yes, we will support other ideas, but we will operate from this lens only. And, it brings me to a sentence that you've written in your book, that the culture we are experiencing does not teach us how to talk or sing our way out of discomfort. In a way, the discomfort that might be very much present in our everyday lives. You might come from a place of privilege. You might have sort of like your own living in your ivory towers. Even then, there is this. Today, we are at a point where the majoritarian politics is so menacing that you can see it happening right outside your home. You open up social media and you might just know that something happened in the very own city that you're living in, like a mob lynching took place maybe 40 kilometers outside of where you're from. And it makes me wonder, what will it take for that number of people or for that class of people to come out of their discomfort? Where does the ball drop, for that matter?
Do you mean for people who have majoritarian privilege?
Mostly, I mean, anyone who has a privilege that protects them from everything that's happening around them. And it doesn't necessarily need to be one privilege or the other, but majoritarian privilege, yes. In the times we're living in today, yes, I would say that.
I don't know how to answer that question. Actually, this is a question I keep thinking about. When will the ball drop, actually? I am very concerned. And I'm concerned because what I'm seeing is not only that people are willing to put up with very large amounts of pain, intolerable conditions, as long as they can be tricked into thinking that their identity is intact or that it is endangered and they must continue to act in certain ways in order to protect their identity. It's an intangible concept, identity, right? It's not like your physical body is necessarily under attack, but the concept of your whatever, your faith, your language, your nation, etc., etc. And I'm frankly astounded at the amount of pain people are willing to put up with, as long as they keep subscribing to the idea that their identity is either under attack or that other people's identities need to be suppressed. It is in some way obviously related to caste, and it is related to class, and it's related to having a supply of cheap labor. Everybody longs for this. And I think one of the things that I think this came out of me just instinctively without me actually thinking too much about it. But I think when the first wave of beef lynching started to happen, and not just beef lynchings, but just in general, there was in UP, I remember that suddenly, overnight, almost all meat shops were shut down, all under whatever the justification might have been. It caused a lot of hardship to a lot of people, and not just in the sense of their income taking a hit, but also in the sense of just you're just not getting something to eat. I remember visiting some relatives at the time, and what had happened was, so obviously this is hearsay and only a story that was told to me by someone. These were very poor people. A domestic worker. She had gone back to her village because there was a wedding in their family, and obviously, as it is, you have very paltry savings, but you've put in everything you have into this wedding, and you want to enjoy yourself, and you want to give people some good food to eat, etc. They had cooked some kind of meat. They obviously cannot afford too much mutton or whatever it was. So there was this digchi of mutton that was lying there. And because all meat shops had been shut down, so obviously they weren't lining up with the shops. They'd already bought the meat. It was already cooked. Apparently, the police came and just overturned the digchi, threw all the food into the mud at the wedding. Now, the veracity of this, whether this happened, how it happened, etc., I don't know. I just have a whatever account that I heard. I kept thinking about this for a very long time. That if the rule says shut down even if it's unjustifiable, even if it's something that really, I mean, it may or may not be a good thing, but if the government has said shut down the meat shop, okay, you can shut down the meat shop. Overstepping, going one step further. This was just plain hurtfulness. It was a way of showing people their place. It was taking the food out of their mouths, literally. They say muh se niwala chhin lena, that kind of thing. Humiliating them, saying that we can do this to you because of whatever. And I feel my initial and immediate response, because I think it was just so visceral and it was so, I was just feeling angry at the time also. But I think there is some truth to it also, perhaps. I felt that what is basically underway is a process which will lead to the Dalitization of Muslims. While the Dalit, I mean, this is something Dalit scholars should really have more nuanced views about. But I do feel that basically what happened in the course of being Dalitized, it happened so far away. There's no history, there's no ethnography that will allow us to know exactly what happened 2,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. But my sense is that what actually happened was that through this process of creating a certain class of outcasts because of what they ate, because of whatever, because, you basically created a class of slaves who would not own property, who were legally not allowed to own property. You read the Manusmriti, you read the Dharmashastras, they're legally not allowed to have any rights in society. They were then given, obviously, the harshest jobs for no pay. And if you just got 2 meals a day, somehow you were expected to survive. And you did it only so that you could wake up the next morning and keep doing this for people. Obviously, everyone wants to live, right? Everyone has the instinct to stay alive. So you just stay alive and you keep doing this. And every time there's a movement, you win, say, one tiny little bit of rights. Once in 500 years, you manage to win tiny little bits. And then the class also starts to splinter. Within the Dalits, you start to have Mahadalits and you start to have this hierarchy that, okay, they work with leather, so they are outcasts, but then those people work with excreta, so they are even lower down the whatever it is, and then people who work in crematoriums, etc. Then so you create a hierarchy within that, and that has been happening for a very long time. And the only way people have had historically, the only way they've had out of this has been to change their faith, to say, okay, if in your system we are out of your, outcasted, so to speak, and untouchable, and we are lower than you, then we reject your system. So whether they did this through Buddhism, whether they did this through changes into Islam or Christianity, whatever, and that process has continued up until independence, certainly. Unfortunately, in South Asia, the way it is, caste has penetrated other religions also, but that doesn't change the fact that religion was one way of doing it. And I think what I am seeing now, this kind of widespread solidarity across the other classes and castes, focusing attention on Muslims, taking away their income, demonizing all the sources of income that they have, etc. I feel like the process is similar. It hasn't yet happened, but I think the instinct, the psychological instinct underpinning it is the same. It is not so much about wanting to wipe out the people themselves. It is about creating a class of people who are so threatened and who are there basically to do your menial jobs, but who don't have the right to assert themselves in any way through customs, through food habits, through culture, through dress, appearance, nothing. Take all of that away, but keep them in that position of marginality and constant threat. So I think this is still evolving. I don't know how this will play out, but these were my feelings. And I still feel that if this is allowed to pass, this is inevitable. That creating a new class of a new sort of caste almost.
It's making me think of this this book that was I haven't read the book. But I would like to really read it. It's called Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. It's written by this American journalist, Isabel Wilkerson. And she also she's talking about, the sort of the history of slavery in America. But in the review that I was reading, she makes very stark comparisons with how the caste system has, permeated through the very social fabric of Indian society. And then she's also, I think, making comparisons to the Nazi, regime of sorts. And it's something that has just been going on. Like it's whether I read other writers or scholars, the signs are there. You don't know what sort of this journey it makes, but the signs are there. And it's sort of like sometimes it becomes very harrowing to imagine the reality that we are kind of witnessing as it happens. It kind of takes me to another question where, and it's a question that I had, it came to me when I was just reading about what's happening, in India and everything, about how there was I scrolled at this special report that there are a lot of young Muslims who are trying to relocate to other parts of the world. It's a very different kind of migration. It's something that, because the anticipation about the homeland that you're from is that in the next 10, 15 years, there might just be such unlivable conditions for the minority that you just want to leave, and that is a very small minority of a minority, like in India, 75% of the Muslims, they wouldn't have that amount of sort of like economic resources or even the any other kind of resources to think about migration and to resettle and to kind of reimagine a life for yourself and your family. And I was just constantly thinking about it and wondering the impact of that kind of reality on an existing minority, the impact of that kind of fear on the minority, the part of the minority that has no means to move. Their migration is not happening from beyond the point of their villages to major urban centers and potentially then back. And in what light do they start looking at their future then? What do they still continue working just for the economic sort of upliftment? Or do they now have to start thinking about complete dislocation of sorts based on the reality that is surrounding them?
When I think about this, my brain really just shuts down, because you're absolutely right. The kind of migrations that we're talking about, the transnational kind of migration that we're talking about, is a very, very, very tiny minority. I mean, even amongst the affluent class, I don't think enough people actually take the decision to leave because your networks are too deep, your family's here, etc., etc. It's not like everyone is leaving, but I completely understand, obviously, the very small minority that is leaving. And I think this is actually historic. You see, before and after the anti-Sikh violence in Punjab, during the years of terrorism, as well as just, before and after 1984, and then what followed. I think this is natural. Every time you feel like your identity is too visible and that your identity is being attacked or that you're going to be discriminated against, even if you're not being discriminated against in an everyday way, you still, the fear of violence and the fear of having to raise children in an environment where they're always going to feel different and that they're not going to be able to feel proud of their identity or whatever it is, that drives people out. And I think historically this has always happened. There's nothing new about this. I mean, if you really go back to it, right back to it, the very word, the Urdu word hijrat, for example, where does it come from? It comes from hijra, and that comes from migration, and that was also because of identity. So whenever you're persecuted, people have moved, whether it's from the time of, the Prophet Muhammad himself, his time, or it's from later, before also, I'm sure that other religions, people moved. The Sufis moved when they were persecuted. So these things, identity-based migration is nothing new. And I'm sure that whatever we feel now about that this is the people who can afford to move are a very tiny minority also applied earlier, that it's always a very tiny minority that moves. It's either people who have very loose ties or people who are under immediate threat, people who feel that they have a lot to lose. But of the people who are left behind, in the case of Indian Muslims in particular, that, because so many of those who identify as Indian Muslims actually probably were converts, and many of them were from lower classes. Professionals, weavers, they were butchers, they were, various professions. And many of them continue to work very small jobs. They work in the informal sector. There have been reports, the Justice Sri Krishna report, there have been commissions, committees, we have the data, we know that their lives are marginal, partly because, they were marginal even before, and partly because of systemic discrimination, which renders them marginal. When you think of the future, like I said, my brain shuts down because I do not imagine them being able to move very easily into safety. Where is safety? Not just abroad, that even within the country. People sometimes think that, okay, they'll move away from a village. For example, when a riot happens or when anti-minority violence happens anywhere, Delhi, Assam, wherever. It's been ongoing for a long time. People tend to pack up and say, okay, we'll move slightly. We'll move into another part of the city. We'll move to another city. We'll leave the village. We'll move to cities, etc. But when something happens on a pan-national scale, when that happens, then you begin to feel like nowhere is safe. And if you are safe nowhere, what are you going to do? if you cannot afford to go anywhere, and then there are rules, restrictions, visas, this, that, you can't do anything, then what do you do? I don't know what will happen. I think I think this must be a very vivid fear in the hearts of all those who actually cannot even imagine being able to afford to move. I mean, most people can't even imagine moving cities very easily, right? It costs
Mm.
money. What are you going to do? What jobs are you going to do? This is something that I don't know if there are any answers to this. I certainly don't have any answers. I think it must be a source of constant terror. You basically live in terror day and night. It's
Mm.
it's
Yeah. This is something I kind of found in two books that you've written. I mean, two of the other books that you've written. In this one, and then in Prelude to a Riot, where you are talking kind of, there are characters who can visibly see the threat, but they still believe that it's not going to happen. They still somehow have this idea that the trust in their relationships, the trust in the life they have lived in that place, the bond that they have with their Zameen, and I can say that when I read Prelude to a Riot, I had a sense of visceral fear run through me. And then, there are parts of this book as well where you've mentioned other. I mean, you've talked about other people as well, and it one makes me think: is that also a way of? Is that dissonance, or is that a sense? Is that some degree of trust that they have with their circumstances, or should I draw strength from it? Because even if they are a minority, there are people who still firmly believe that the tide will turn, and they trust that things won't necessarily go as horrifying as they seem.
Yeah. I've often heard people just say express faith sometimes in their neighbors, sometimes in. I read a lot of partition literature, and I think because, like I say, in Bread, Cement, Cactus, I do believe that partition is an ongoing process, perhaps, that 1947 was not uh, a, a kind of the completion. It wasn't the realization of a process. It was the first act in a kind of process that started somewhere in the 1920s or 30s, I think. And you read those stories, fiction particularly, and you see again and again this sense, particularly people who have a little bit, people who have, say, some land, deep roots in the land, um, relationships with other people, positive relationships. You've lived with people in harmony for hundreds of years. Some part of it is denial, where you see the discourses around you, you see people changing around you, but you want to hold on to the faith that no, this won't happen to me. That the bonds will prove to be stronger. And in some cases, we see that they did prove stronger, but in many cases, we see that individuals are overwhelmed by, forces larger than themselves, or we see a kind of playbook in action. What happens is that sometimes the bonds actually are stronger. You see this because your local neighbors will protect you, and they have no intention necessarily of taking over your land. But what happens is that the mob that comes to your door is not your local mob. It has been brought from elsewhere, or the leaders are from elsewhere, and then they'll pick up local riffraff, whoever has nothing to lose and wants to kind of attack you. And this happened over and over and over again on both sides of the border. And we see this happens in riots even now. A lot of the leaders of riots actually are not local people, or they are people with a vested stake. And if they can't find enough local support, it's very easy. Just go to the next village or go to the next district or wherever. And uh, you hear these conversations. I read the reportage in the week immediately after of any violent incident, and you'll often see that it actually is a group who will always say that, but we don't know these people. They're not from this mohalla. They're not from this city. And I think some of it is that, and perhaps some of that faith in your community, in your neighbors, etc., is justified because you would do the same for them, etc. But having said that, I think some of it is also a kind of denial because you cannot live with that much fear all the time. Human beings are not capable of it. I'm sure there's some psychological research around this, some science to it, that if I would become dysfunctional if I was to day and night just constantly think about fear and threat and risk. I wouldn't be able to do anything productive. What's the point? What's the point of going out, earning a living, putting money in the bank, trying to kind of buy a house? Why will I buy a house if I'm afraid that that house will be taken away from me 6 months later? Uh, why will I buy a car if I think anyone can come and set fire to that car? Why will I, obviously with cattle, we see that that's very clear that it basically pushes an entire community out of the cattle trade, and it has devastating consequences for cattle at large, I think. I mean, we are seeing that also happen.
Yeah.
But you can't do anything if you're afraid of all the time. What you can do is within your fear, you will try to find places of safety. So you'll say, okay, let me not deal in cattle, or let me not deal in animals altogether, or let me not say put my identity on display. So I will not say the names of hotels will be different. They'll be the neutral or majoritarian names rather than, or let me not say, uh, let me not invest in objects, that are easily demolished, or let's say they're easily stolen or whatever. You start to invest in different ways. Those are the things people try and do, but you have to cope with fear. Otherwise, life is not possible. You just and denial also, in some ways, it also allows you a kind of freedom, right? I think it allows you not only the freedom to go on living, it also allows you to stay emotionally functional.
Yeah.
Without a certain amount of denial, you can't love people, no? You can't invest in love either. You can't invest in friendship. You can't keep your friendships alive if you allow the fear to take you over completely. So I think a lot of people in denial, like the character of the grandfather in Prelude, I think he is not just in denial. Yes, he obviously does not want to let go of his life. So his denial is protecting himself, that he does not want to, uh, say, uproot himself, begin anew, let go of the land. The land means everything to him, etc. At the same time, it's also keeping him sane. It's keeping him human.
Yeah.
You want to stay human until the rest of your life, right?
Yeah. I mean, these are some very powerful ways of also keeping intact your sense of who you are. Like you can't be shifting every aspect of who you are because the climate doesn't allow you to function like that. I think at the core of it all, there are certain non-negotiables that we have. With bread, cement, cactus, you kind of, it's a departure from a sort of, if they can be called memoir writing as well, sense, right? Like it's very different from the other kind of memoirs I've read. Did you particularly decide you wanted to approach your own personal storytelling in this way, or where did this really come from? Like I was really curious to know, like, how did you weave in everything from research to recollection to, reportage as well?
Yeah. Yeah, before I did this book, I had done a few personal essays. And the book that I did, the nonfiction book, which is also a combination of reportage and memoir, sort of not so much memoir, but kind of what I was doing for many years was maintaining a blog. And I also was a journalist at the time. So my journalism would obviously go into magazines and things like that. But the blog was a way of me reflecting on what I was doing on my job. And I think that really cemented my sense of my learnings of whatever I was learning from the world, um, and helped me find my own voice. It kind of there are things you cannot say in reportage.
Hmm.
So, like, for example, if I'm writing about children starving somewhere, slowly starving to death, I can write that there are children out there and that I have witnessed this. In reportage, necessarily, there is no sense of the terror that strikes you when you
Hmm.
are looking at this and how it's changing you. And the blog was one way for me to do that, to reflect on that. So this had over 10 years, I think, slowly become a kind of habit to do the story, to go looking for material, but also to think about its impact and to think about the things that are leading you to that story and the wider networks, etc., at the structures at play here. And when I started to do personal essays, which were more directly memoir writing, I think I was also reflecting on things that are happening in society through the lens of what's happening to me and what I'm
Hmm.
observing. And I kind of think that is more my thing. It's uh, I do not know how to understand the world except through my own experience. I can look at other people's experience, but I need to also internalize it. I need to
Hmm.
absorb that experience and think about it from as if not to kind of appropriate it, but to kind of absorb it within my experience, that I am looking at you, I'm witnessing this, I'm hearing you. And based on whatever it is that I have learned from my life, I'm also learning to think about structures of power in society. And this is something that I have been moving towards for, I think, the last 10 years of my writing. For example, I did this essay on nudity once. It's a long essay on not nudity so much, the female body, the kind of both the power and the um, judgment of the female body. And it is composed of course, you can say it's, I don't like the word very broadly. It's called a think piece, You think about things in society based on what you're observing in society. That is not so much direct reportage, but it is me just observing a series of things, what's happening in the news, what's being reported by other people. But it also comes from personal experience, from watching this. There used to be the statue in the colony I used to live in. My mom bought an apartment, and it was a very, like in India, whenever you want to market an apartment as posh or whatever, as higher standard of living, you give it a westernized look and name and all of that. So these are things that, of course, those things happen. So amongst the other things the builder had done, he'd done a fake imitation of the Venus de Milo statue. So it's a Greek statue. Obviously, the woman is mostly unclothed in the statue, and the arms were cut off in the way like the
Hmm.
original, or not the original, but whatever was salvaged of the statue of Venus. So that had been there in our colony. It was sort of there at the end of the niche, and 4 or 5 statues like that were there in the complex. And I'd been seeing them for years and they were just there. And then one day my mom came and told me, have you noticed? Somebody has put a nightie on the Venus. Even in a statue, lifeless form, somebody that it was really offensive to them that the sight of that body was offensive to them. So then that statue remained clothed for a long time. And then after a few days, the nightie disappeared. Somebody must have needed a nightie, so they took the nightie. It's cloth, it's useful for a live human being. So the live human being must have taken it away. Then Venus was without clothes for a few days. Then somebody, whoever was offended, was really offended. So then they went and put a shirt on Venus. And then for some time she wore that shirt, and then somebody stole the shirt also. So, and for a while it was funny, there's all these shenanigans that were happening in the colony. Then mom told me, I mostly just never step out of the house. So it's my mother who used to tell me all these things. And then she brought this to my attention. Somebody found it so offensive, that naked statue. They went and bashed in the breasts, like actually took a hammer or something and broke it. And then it wasn't funny any longer, right? Because somewhere there was this thing that rather than just look at a female body, you will destroy it. Yeah. Either even that lifeless statue must conform to your ideas, or it will be destroyed. And ultimately that statue was removed, it was damaged. It was not replaced by a new statue. Because this majoritarian thinking, this patriarchal majoritarian thinking, whatever it was, ultimately, even the people who were non-violent, somewhere at the back of their minds, all of them thought that, better get rid of it. So I will not destroy it, but I will remove it. Done the same thing. You effectively destroyed, you removed, right? Made invisible. So through that, then I began to think about violence, about women, about bodies, the way in which they use their bodies, the way in which, for example, it can become a form of protest, like it did in Manipur. The mothers of Manipur disrobed as a way of shaming people, and the shame attached, and the way in which you use shame, either you can absorb it or you can turn it around, use your body to shame other people, etc. I was doing a lot of that kind of writing for a while, and I think I intend to continue doing that for a while, because there are many things I have many thoughts about. I have thoughts about writing, I have thoughts about publishing, I have thoughts about, for example, the film world and the structures of power there that are at work, and majoritarian thinking and patriarchal thinking, and the way in which these processes work. But in order for me to say anything, I need to root it in my experience. With Breadsum and Cactus, it couldn't be only about my experience, because I was talking about very diverse things also. I wanted to talk about, say, displacement. I have moved voluntarily, or my mother has moved, or whatever it is, that it's not the same thing as displacement. So what I am experiencing from a position of relative privilege. Even if I'm being forced to move for income, it's not the same thing as being forcibly moved by the state or by an industrialist or whatever it is. So I needed to marry these experiences together, to attach them, my experience, but my experience in a place where I am not necessarily at the heart of the story. I'm an observer, but then also from that, then leading onto experiences around identity and movement and migration, which are rooted in some kind of experiences. And also at the same time to acknowledge that your story is not unique, that you're not special, that these things happen to everybody. They happen to a community, or speakers of that language, or to all women, for example.
I mean, I think also, in a way, your book kind of is a prime example of how everything is connected. And I think the force of writing, or the force of good writing, is really that it makes the reader feel how close they are to the reality that they think it does not impact them. And I really found that embedded through the course of that book, that you start with an experience, and then you kind of weave into the larger themes, or the larger even larger experiences, to a point that by the end of the chapter I don't necessarily need to have any connection with any of them to feel that it affects me. And I think that really is that is why I was curious to ask, like, because that kind of memoir writing is something very different. It's it takes the reader on a different path of inquiry altogether, because you're not just sitting reflecting on it. You are now curious to understand, how with the official languages of India, like, where are we? Like, what is happening to all these languages and dialects that people have been speaking for millennia? but they are not considered official, for example. And I do feel that it is important to constantly acknowledge disconnectedness. I mean, that's one way of me finding an answer of how things can change. Maybe that's one point of navigation of sorts. There is this one line that you've mentioned in the book, which is remembrance is essential before people can reflect, and I think that line also stood out for me, considering you talk about partition and you're talking about some big historical events in the course of India's history, and how are they remembered, how people are taught to remember them. History books are being re-edited all the time in the country we're talking about. So as citizens of the India we're living in today, the majoritarian and the minorities, everyone, as a writer, as an observer, as someone who is so deeply investigating and investing in how our country is growing and evolving, what do you really think this time that we've witnessed over the last, I would say 10, 15 odd years, what do you think will the citizens of the country reflect upon in the coming, I don't know, decade?
It depends on what they remember, right? And it is famously said that public memory is short, and it is indeed very short. We see this even with COVID, for example. Now there's a new variant in India, and it's amazing because the exact same discourse is playing out just 3 years later, and people are not able to reflect even on what happened just 3 years ago. That the same thing where the big rallies, etc., will continue even when the threat is sort of there. But after the elections is when you start telling people to mask up, not before and not during. I mean, this is the kind of thing where you really kind of have to ask yourself that, oh my God, are we really so gullible as people? Or is it that in the face of so much adversity and hardship, that just remembrance becomes another act that brings pain, and that we are eager to avoid it? I don't know. Maybe it is that also has some part to play. I think one thing that certainly in the next 10 years, what people have to contend with is three things. Whether they like it or not, they'll have to contend with it. They may not want to think about it, but they'll have to. The first is climate change, I think. We're kind of seeing climate disruptions now. People kind of tend to minimize not only the threat, they also kind of minimize the dialogue itself. So, for example, we're seeing flooding in all cities because of over construction, change in river patterns, this, that, etc. More and more devastation. Coastal areas are at high risk. India has a very long coastline, and so many of our big cities are near coasts, etc. All big cities are near rivers. There just is no conversation about this, and because we've lived on the ground floor, we've kind of faced the brunt of this for many years now, and we're seeing it getting worse and worse and worse in India. And perhaps in other parts of the world too. I mean, I don't read enough to know what's happening in all parts of the world, but this is something that, so when you're thinking about climate disruptions, we tend to think about a few days of pain in the year. For in the monsoon, 1 day of flooding. It's not like that. That 1 day of flooding causes massive damage, thousands of crores worth of damage. What are you going to do when all your granaries start to get flooded? What are you going to do? What are you going to do when your food stocks run out? Already India's buffer stocks are lower than they used to be. There is no conversation around this. There will have to be, if it gets to a point of pain, there will have to be, because where is the food then? Who's getting it? How is it being stored? Is it dry? Is it safe, etc.? Those are things we'll have to deal with. The other thing I think that young people particularly will have to deal with is the employment crisis. We've always had this struggle against mechanization, I think, since the age of mechanization began. But what happens at moments of crisis, at least in the short run, somewhere between 10 to 50 years maybe, is that people have to be reskilled then. right? So the de-skilling is happening, the reskilling is not happening. And I think what kind of world we're preparing for, are people equipped for that in terms of both technological know-how, but also in terms of just, if you're not good for anything else in the new world, what are you going to do? Those are things that people need to think about. And I think some of the answers will have to come from the people, because they're not going to come from any structure. Not only in India, I think in the West too, they'll have to come from the people. And I think the third thing people will have to contend with at some point is the limits of their own hate and anger. Anger, people can turn it out and outwards. Most of us do, like we say in Hindi, किसी पे निकालते हैं, गुस्सा निकालते हैं. तो, निकालते क्यों है? Why do we lash out at people? Very often we lash out at people who are dearest to us. I mean, I'm guilty of it too, that you need to make a living, you need to be nice to people. So you keep up a certain kind of dignity outside the house. When you come home and you feel like you can relax, you tend to kind of let go. You lash out at people, or you're just not so careful about what you say. You hurt feelings, etc., etc. It's a very normal thing. But when you're constantly full of rage, constantly, you kind of go on the rampage, you hurt other people, you destroy livelihoods, you vote in particular ways, you kind of, you make your whole life about running other people down. There has to be a limit to it. I mean, you read other people, wiser people than me, and monks and all, who'd say that, it consumes you. When do you become aware that it is consuming you? At some point, some self-reflection has to happen. Maybe it doesn't happen when you're very young. Maybe it happens at some point when you're a little older. I'm hoping that it'll happen, because otherwise, what is your life? Just one relentless, from beginning to end, this kind of, you are this angry monster that's going about, destroying others. Is that all there is to you? Ideally, I think that reflection should happen. I mean, otherwise, there's no humanity left.
Yeah, you're right. I think all the 3 points you mentioned are the realities that, whether we like it or not, we will be grappling with. And those realities will not distinguish between whether you're a majority or a minority. Like, that's never going to happen, and with climate change, we are seeing that it's impacting people regardless of where they are and where they come from. Yeah, I think it's a very poignant note to end our conversation on, to think about and reflect deeply on the world that we are creating around us, and the world that we are letting just be driven around us. I think there's one thing which I'm constantly trying to understand and reflect a lot on, is how do you keep on reassessing your role in the community or in the society or in the relations that you're living in. You can't just tell yourself this story that this is all I can do and this is all that I am capable of, because at some point or the other, there are more opportunities that you might be getting. You might be meeting different people. You might be interacting. You might be reading another book. You might just be, just moving to another city. And if you choose to just tell yourself that this is who I am and this is the ideal and principle I live with, then you're basically shrinking away from the chance of contributing to a society better. It's a loss for the community and for yourself. So I think just going back to the conversation we've had, I think it's really helped me see so many different ways that as an observer, as a writer, as someone who's able to have access and privilege of reading books like yours, can just do better. So thank you so much for the time. And I really hope, I'm looking forward to reading more of your writing. And maybe at some point meeting you as well.
Thank you so much. And those are very wise words. And I do hope that we will get a chance to meet.
Thank you, Annie.